Good morning. It is a great and extraordinary privilege for me as a former scholar, Rotary scholar from 30 years ago, for me to finally have the public opportunity to thank the entire International Rotary family for what it is that you invested in a life-changing way for me. I am so very, very thankful, and I also in this moment find it an extraordinary opportunity to share a conviction that has been shaping me over these last 3 decades. And here is that single one conviction. I believe that one day our grandchildren will give us a history exam. And it won't be a test about what it is that we know about history. It will be a test about what it is that we did about history. It seems that eventually history convenes a tribunal of our grandchildren. And they simply ask us, Grandma, Grandpa, where were you? Where were you, Grandpa, when the Jews were fleeing Nazi Germany and looking for safe shelter in the world? Or Grandma, where were you when Nelson Mandela was rotting for 25 years in prison fighting the apartheid system? What did you do? Did you raise your voice? Over time, there are just a few great dramas of history that our grandchildren learn about with great clarity, and they just want to know, what did you do? It's a way of asking, what kind of family am I from? And what a glorious thing to be able to look that child straight in the eye and to say, with all humility and gentleness, well, we just did the right thing. We did our part. To say, as my father's generation could say, that, well, we did our part at great cost to make sure that the forces of good had what they needed to wade ashore on D-Day and to bring an end to the Nazi nightmare. Or to say, well, all over the world we raised our voices in protest against the apartheid regime, and we didn't stop until Nelson Mandela walked free. Indeed, just imagine your grandchildren asking you, Grandma, Grandpa, where were you when children like me were perfectly safe from the polio disease, but there were thousands of the poorest children around the world who were crippled by the disease every day? And how glorious for you to look that child straight in the eye and to say with all humility and all gentleness, well, we just did what was right. We raised our voices. And we raised millions of dollars, and we didn't stop until every child was safe from polio. And in that moment, your grandchild's heart will just swell with a quiet joy and pride, because they will have learned something fundamental about goodness and about the kind of family that they come from. And such an affirmation is all the more powerful because they will also know that not everybody passes the tests of history. There were millions, in fact, who did nothing about the rising evil of Nazis in Germany. There were millions who said nothing about apartheid in South Africa. There were millions who closed their eyes and gave not a penny to safeguard children from the terror of polio. And so it does raise the question, what fundamental challenge of history might we be missing right now? Now, it's impossible to say for sure what question will be on our particular history exam, because it's our grandchildren who get to make up the questions based on the clarity of their hindsight, not based on the confusion of our present preoccupations. But there is one question I am sure will be on the exam, because it is the most iconic form of evil in human history. and because in our era, right now, there is more of it than ever. This will come as a surprise to almost all of us because, like polio, almost all of our families are quite safe from this evil. And our safety is actually something that puts us at great risk of failing this exam, because it's likely that we would have no idea that there are millions of the poorest who right now are victimized by this evil every day. And that evil is very simply slavery. That's right. This ancient evil by which one human being owns another and uses violence to force them to work, this slavery actually thrives in our world like never before. And if when I say the word slavery, and you think of illustrations from dusty old books of Moses freeing the ancient Hebrews from slavery in Egypt, or of Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves from the plantations in America, or if you think of those pictures of old ships stuffed with cargo of human beings, if these are our images, then you need to come with me on a journey of discovery that I think will turn your world upside down. There really are just three things you need to know about modern day slavery. First of all, that it is more vast than ever. Second, that it is just as brutal as ever. But thirdly, it is more stoppable than ever. First, slavery is more vast than ever. And this is why I think our grandchildren for sure will ask about slavery in our era, because there are actually more people in slavery today in our world than in any other time in human history. Experts tell us that there are nearly 36 million people held illegally in slavery in our world today. That's more than the entire population of the nation of Canada. And it is 3 times more than all the people who were extracted from Africa during 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade. And the profits are astronomical. Annually, the modern slavery business produces $150 billion in profit. That's more profit than Coca-Cola, Disney, General Electric, IBM, Chevron, Wells Fargo Bank, and ExxonMobil combined. Slavery is not a relic from history. It is a reality today on a scale like never before. So if our mental image of slavery is a black and white photograph from the 19th century, we will need to update it with color. For the millions of 21st century slaves who are laboring, for instance, on agricultural facilities around the world. Or if this is the picture of slavery in our minds, it needs to actually reflect the millions of slaves who are trapped by violence today in brick factories. The horrors and degradations of slavery, which we would have learned about as children, continue to actually afflict children on an even more vast scale today. And of course, children who in other eras found themselves born into slavery, today they likewise find themselves inheriting that yoke of slavery by the millions. And the old violence and humiliation of slavery, it takes on 21st century forms. Now, if these realities of modern day slavery seem shocking and surreal and maybe just unbelievable, I know exactly how you feel, because I can remember the very first day that I met a slave for the first time. It was a little tiny 10-year-old girl, just a few years older than my own daughters, who was held in slavery, forced to sit on the floor and manufacture cigarettes 7 days a week, 12 to 14 hours a day, year in and year out. Or the time I was conducting an undercover investigation into sex trafficking in Southeast Asia, and I was taken into the back room of a brothel, and I was presented with about a dozen children between the ages of 5 and 10 years of age, who were being sold to foreign pedophiles and sex tourists. After 20 years of working with International Justice Mission, which is the largest international anti-slavery organization in the world, I can stand before you and very simply assure you that the face of slavery today is real. And it is more vast than ever. My colleagues and I have met tens of thousands of slaves by name, and they are on every continent, and they're in every country. They're in my country, and they're in yours. This is why our grandchildren one day are going to ask us about it. The second thing we must know about modern slavery is not only that it is more vast than ever, but also that it is as brutal as ever. This is what I want to be clear about. We're not talking today about metaphorical slavery. We're not talking about harsh working conditions that are slave-like conditions. Nor are we talking about parents putting their children to work to try to support the family income. We are talking about human beings owning other human beings, and human beings who are coerced to work by the sheer force of violence. These boys are beaten by their master if they do not comply. These men had their hands cut off when they tried to run away from their owner. There's a steel padlock on the cell where this young woman sleeps. And these slaves are held in this brick factory by terror. The brutality of slavery is real, and the face of those who administer the violence is also real. But here, finally, is the good news. You remember that I told you there were 3 things we needed to know about slavery. It's more vast than ever, it's as brutal as ever, but also, thirdly, it is more stoppable than ever. And why is that? For several reasons. First, for the first time in human history, slavery is illegal everywhere in the world. But why then are so many still held in slavery by the millions? Well, the answer is actually really quite simple. Slavery exists in a massive scale in our world today because there are huge swaths of our world where you simply do not get in trouble for enslaving a poor person. In other words, while there are laws against slavery in every country, there are many countries where these laws are simply not enforced at all. For instance, in South Asia, statistics now demonstrate that if you enslave a poor person, you're more likely to be struck by lightning than you are to ever actually be convicted and sent to jail for that crime. And while slavery does exist in every country, it has actually concentrated itself in a few countries where slave traffickers can freely get away with it. In fact, 70% of the world's slaves are in just 10 countries. If you think about it, it's like the global AIDS epidemic. Every country has an HIV/AIDS problem, and every country has to come up with a strategy to address it. But if you think about it as a global epidemic, what we learned is the tide was turned when we realized that 70% of the HIV transmissions were actually coming out of a handful of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And when the world realized this, it began to focus its resources and its strategies and was able to now reach a tipping point of success in defeating HIV/AIDS. This then leads us to the final reason why slavery is more stoppable than ever. For the first time, we are learning how to measure it, and we have found the vaccine that stops it. Imagine how difficult it would have been to try to fight polio if you couldn't count who has it, and therefore you couldn't measure whether or not the vaccine was actually reducing it. And this has been the problem with slavery. After it became illegal in the modern era, it became a hidden crime. And so it then became difficult to measure. But in recent years, we have now come up with techniques to measure slavery, and now we can increasingly measure which interventions work to reduce it and which ones do not. And here is what we've learned. When you combine effective law enforcement with excellent services to the survivors of slavery, slavery rates drop dramatically. At International Justice Mission, we've been able to measure this many times. Our first project was with the Gates Foundation, where the goal was to measurably reduce sex trafficking of children in a mega city in the Philippines by 20% in just 4 short years. But when the results of the project came back, the study by outside auditors showed that sex trafficking of kids had collapsed by 79%. And then, when we attacked the problem in 2 more major cities, sex slavery of children fell by 77% and 86%. You see, it turns out that those who are slave owners are not brave people. And if they think they're going to get caught and that they're going to jail, they just stop doing it. So what does that have to do with all of you and with this massive worldwide family of Rotarians? Well, you indeed are a unique force in the world. You bring together a global network of volunteers who dedicate their time and your talent to take on the world's most pressing humanitarian challenges. And look where the world once was in its fight against polio. A perfectly good vaccine existed to stop it, but the world's poorest and most vulnerable were suffering and dying without it. And the rest of the world simply didn't know about the crisis and had not built the capacity to address it. But Rotarians changed everything. You sounded the alarm. You woke up the world. And in partnership, you raised more than $1 billion to make sure that everyone could get the vaccine. And today, I believe Rotary is uniquely positioned once again to change everything. For the first time in human history, there is a generation alive that could bring an end to slavery as a force in human affairs. In thousands of years, this has never been possible before. But now, on your patch of history, it is possible. We know what stops slavery, but there are millions of the world's poorest who simply don't get the vaccine. And you can change all that. You can sound the alarm. You can rally the political will and the financial resources to make sure that the poorest are safe from slavery. The forgotten millions who once were living under the terror of polio had no voice, and so you loaned them your voice. And so they were heard and they were seen, and now millions are safe. Today, another unique moment in history is before you. And as Pope Francis and the representatives of the world's greatest religions recently gathered to pledge to do all that they could to end slavery, this is what they affirmed, quote, "Today we have the opportunity, the awareness, the wisdom, the innovation and technology to achieve this human and moral imperative to end slavery." Likewise, for tens of thousands of you Rotarians who are gathered here in Seoul today, we invite you to very simply log on to this website, this very special website that has been developed to give you very concrete next steps of how you can join other Rotarians around the world in the fight against slavery. As President Ravi said in this groundbreaking speech that he gave at the Carter Center just last year in Atlanta, he said, quote, "We are doing away with the idea that human trafficking is something that doesn't happen anymore or that only happens somewhere else. It is here and it is now, and it is everyone's responsibility to recognize that." President Ravi says it is for everyone to make their voices heard, to say human trafficking must end. Responsibility. responsibility. That's really what our grandchildren are asking about in their history quiz when they ask, where were you? And this is my great hope, is that one day when they ask us, Grandma, Grandpa, where were you when millions of the world's poor were languishing in slavery in numbers greater than ever? I hope we can say, looking them straight in the eye with all humility and gentleness, that we did our part. And together, we changed history for good. Thank you all very much.